Hi there, thanks for finding this video on YouTube. My name is Richard and I operate a Toronto history company called Muddy York Walking Tours. I give walking tours on the history, architecture, and culture of Toronto, but I also do a lot of illustrated talks like this one. The talk that follows is on a woman named Elizabeth Simcoe, and I wanted to share it in honor of Simcoe Day, an annual holiday that takes place this year on Monday, August the 1st, 2022. So who was Elizabeth Simcoe? Well, as you'll hear through my presentation, she was an intrepid woman who did a lot to document life in Upper Canada, what is now Southern Ontario, in the 1790s. And as I mentioned, my choice to profile her now was inspired by Simcoe Day, the holiday that takes place on the first Monday of every August. In some calendars, this holiday is only identified as a civic holiday, and it's true that it's only called Simcoe Day in the Toronto area. Various municipalities name this holiday after different historical characters. It's called Joseph Brant Day in Burlington, Ontario. Joseph Brant was a prominent Mohawk First Nations figure. He was both a military and political leader who rose to prominence during and after the American Revolution. The civic holiday is called Benjamin Vaughan Day in Vaughan, Ontario. Vaughan was a doctor and politician who worked to negotiate peace between Great Britain and the United States following the American Revolution. And the holiday Monday is called Colonel By Day in Ottawa. This is for Colonel John By, the English military engineer who supervised construction of the Rideau Canal and founded the settlement called Bytown in the process. Bytown would eventually grow into the city of Ottawa. And here in Toronto, the August civic holiday is named after John Graves Simcoe. He was a general in the British Army during the American Revolution who became the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada when the province was created in 1791. Upper Canada eventually became the province of Ontario, and Simcoe is often credited as its founding figure. He also established the town of York in 1793. This town eventually became the city of Toronto in 1834. John Graves Simcoe has been commemorated and celebrated pretty extensively in hundreds of books and academic articles and paintings and statues, and even, as I mentioned, in a holiday named after him here in Toronto. But most of the history that took place when he was here in the Canadian colonies in the 1790s has traditionally been written by and about men. By contrast, most people only know about Elizabeth Simcoe because of her husband. This seems unfair because Elizabeth Simcoe deserves to be celebrated in her own right. When she traveled through the Canadian colonies in the 1790s with her husband, she chose to do things that practically no other woman or wife or mother would have done at the end of the 1700s. She spent the 5 years between 1791 and 1796 traveling through the provinces of Upper and Lower Canada. She made hundreds of diary entries and paintings. Her writing and her illustrations have left a vivid description of what life here was like at the time. But there's even more to her story than that. Most of those other women, the women who made up the British gentry and who were the wives of colonial bureaucrats, chose to stay at home in England, drinking tea, sewing, and playing cards, while their husbands traveled around the world and went about the business of setting up the British Empire. But Elizabeth Simcoe was different. She even painted this map, marking off everywhere she stopped in Upper Canada on her 5-year journey. The records that she's left to us offer a rare and incredibly unique glimpse into what the southern parts of Quebec and Ontario looked like 230 years ago. Elizabeth Simcoe was a true documentarian. So that's why I want to commemorate Simcoe Day this year by exploring just some of the history that Elizabeth Simcoe recorded in her own words and pictures. There is far too much for me to cover in about 40 minutes, but I'll do my best. For now, please enjoy the duration of my presentation. So let's begin our look back at the life of Elizabeth Simcoe. She wasn't known as Elizabeth Simcoe until she got married, of course. Her maiden name was Elizabeth Posthuma Gwilym. Elizabeth's father, Thomas Gwilym, was also a part of Canadian history. He was an aide to the legendary General James Wolfe, whose death at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham has been commemorated in paintings and has become the stuff of Canadian historical legend. But Thomas Gwilym was killed in a later battle in Germany on January the 29th, 1762. When he left home for his last battle, he had no idea that his wife, Elizabeth Spinks, was pregnant. It was a surprise for her too. She was 38 years old and she'd never had any other children. Tragedy struck when Elizabeth died soon after childbirth. Elizabeth, the mother, was buried at the Gwilym family's grave enclosure at St. Dubricius Church in the village of Whitchurch. Elizabeth, the daughter, was baptized at St. Dubricius Church, the same church, on the same day that her mother was laid to rest. This is a sketch of the Gwilym family tomb at St. Dubricius Church. The tragedy surrounding the death of both of Elizabeth Gwilym's parents led to her rather unusual middle name of Posthuma. She grew up after the death of both her parents without ever knowing either one. But fortunately, she had help. This is Samuel Graves. He was Elizabeth's uncle. Along with his wife, Margaret, who was Elizabeth's mother's sister, he took young Elizabeth in. Elizabeth became a ward of her Aunt Margaret and Uncle Samuel and lived with them at their home in the Blackdown Hills region of Devon in southwest England. Elizabeth fell in love with the beautiful landscape of Devonshire. She started making paintings like this one. As she roamed through the rolling countryside, taking in the moors, she spent a lot of time on long walks and rides on horseback, capturing the countryside as she went along. This is another one of her paintings of the local countryside. But eventually, Elizabeth found a new distraction when a young gentleman came to stay with her aunt and uncle in 1781. Elizabeth, who was now 19 years old, found herself spending more and more time with the young man who was now sharing her aunt and uncle's estate. This young gentleman was, of course, John Graves Simcoe. He was born in a village called Cotterstock in England on February the 25th, 1752. This made him a full 10 years older than Elizabeth Gwilym. Simcoe's father was an officer on board the Royal Navy who died of pneumonia on board his ship, HMS Pembroke, in May of 1759, during the British campaign to take Quebec. Young John was only 7 years old when his father died, and like Elizabeth, he knew what it was like to lose a parent. This is a portrait of an 18-year-old John Graves Simcoe painted in 1770 when he enlisted in the British Army. He'd fought in the American Revolution and earned a reputation as a war hero, but his mother Catherine died in 1776 while he was still away fighting. So when Simcoe returned to England after the war, he came here to a place called Hembury Fort House. This was the home of Simcoe's godfather, Samuel Graves, and Samuel's wife, Margaret. But the picturesque estate in the Blackdown Hills was also the home of Samuel and Margaret's ward, Elizabeth Gwilym. Elizabeth Gwilym soon caught John Simcoe's eye, and the couple started spending time together. They had both lost their parents, they had no siblings, but they soon found happiness in one another's company. John Graves Simcoe was a popular and gallant military hero. He was also quite tall. According to some accounts, he stood a full 6'2" tall. At 29 years old, his early adulthood had been full of adventure, but he also had a future full of promise. Elizabeth was a decade younger. She was 19 years old, pretty and slight, standing about 5 feet tall. She was intelligent. She could paint and do needlework. She could carry on an intelligent conversation in English, in French, or in German. The brave military hero and the pretty young debutante started taking walks here through the Blackdown Hills together. At first, they were always chaperoned by Elizabeth's Aunt Margaret, who was skeptical of the blossoming young romance, mostly because of the 10-year age gap between John and Elizabeth. But soon, Margaret started letting them go out on their own. They would go on long horseback rides or meandering walks through the local countryside. Elizabeth was short enough that she had to trot every few steps to keep up with Simcoe's long-legged stride. Love had its way. On December the 30th, 1782, John and Elizabeth made the short trip down the hill from Hembury Fort House to the Church of St. Mary and St. Giles in the tiny village of Buckrow. The Simcoes were married in front of their friends and their few surviving family members, and Elizabeth Gwilym was now Elizabeth Simcoe. The couple used Elizabeth's inheritance to buy an estate of their own called Wolford Lodge, which was nearly right around the corner from Hembury. They would go on to raise a family of their own and live out the remainder of their lives in the very same hills where they'd first met and fallen in love. Except, of course, for the 5 years that they spent living here and founding the town that eventually became Toronto in the province that grew into Ontario. When John was appointed Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada on September the 12th, 1791, he and Elizabeth left England almost immediately. The Simcoes brought the two youngest of their 6 children. These included 2-year-old Sophia, born in 1789, and a son, Francis, who had just been born earlier in 1791. But even though she was crossing the Atlantic with 2 of her youngest, Elizabeth dedicated countless hours to documenting what she experienced once she got here. This is just one of many extracts from her diaries. I put together a few highlights of Elizabeth Simcoe's Canadian journey using her very own illustrations and words. There was, of course, far too much information for me to include all of it, but I've done my best to pick some compelling material. Elizabeth Simcoe and her family boarded their ship, HMS Triton, and set sail for the Canadas on September the 26th, 1791. She wrote in her diary of how she became giddy, which meant that she was seasick. But by the time the ship began to approach North American shores, Elizabeth Simcoe was up on deck chronicling what she saw. Elizabeth Simcoe made these sketches of the islands off Nova Scotia and the coastline along the St. Lawrence River. She wrote of how, when she went up on deck, the weather was so rough that I was obliged to hold fast by a cannon. And yet she wrote that she quite enjoyed the thoughts of the long journey we had before us and the perpetual change of scene it will afford. Elizabeth's diary records how on October the 29th, 1791, their ship approached the Strait of Canso, which divides the peninsula of Nova Scotia from Cape Breton Island. She rendered this painting of Isle Madame, an island on the southeastern corner of Cape Breton Island. She described it as a bold and perpendicular dark red rock, shaded almost to black and covered with pine trees. This is Elizabeth Simcoe's painting of the Isle of Entry, one of the Magdalena Islands in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. She wrote of how going down the St. Lawrence affords the most delightful scenery, whether it be between Kingston and Montreal, among the number of wooded islands of all sizes, or the woody, rocky shores bordering the rapids and the transparent, clear waters. Elizabeth painted this watercolor showing a bend in the St. Lawrence River in 1792. She wrote of how the scenery of the St. Lawrence River was almost to persuade me it is worthwhile to cross the Atlantic for the pleasure of voyaging on this delightful lake-like river, the setting sun reflecting the deepest shades from the shores and throwing rich tints on the water. She seemed less fond of Quebec City, at least at first. This might have been because when they arrived there on November the 11th, 1791, winter had already started. Remarks in her diary noted how dismal of a town Quebec appeared through the mist, sleet, and rain. The weather forced the Simcoes to spend the winter of late 1791 and early 1792 in Quebec. One of the local landmarks that Elizabeth Simcoe found particularly memorable was Montmorency Falls, which is located 13 kilometers or 8 miles east of Quebec City. The water of the falls cascades 83 meters or 272 feet into the St. Lawrence River at the mouth of the Montmorency River. This makes for a greater height than at Niagara Falls. Elizabeth described how the river, which dashes over a very rocky bed amongst the woods, makes the whole scene very picturesque. She painted Wolf's Cove near Quebec City. This is where Thomas Quillam, the father whom she'd never known, had landed with General James Wolfe and the British Army before defeating the French at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham. This must have been a poignant part in her journey. After all, in addition to thoughts of her own father, her husband John's father died of pneumonia on board a ship just before making it this far. But even though she made at least a few paintings of Wolf's Cove, her diary held no written reflections on either her own father or of her father-in-law. Perhaps she chose to keep private any thoughts on the premature passing of both these men, neither of whom she ever met. As the party passed the Thousand Islands, Elizabeth wrote, "The different sizes and shapes of these innumerable isles have a pretty appearance. Some of them are many miles in extent. Many of them are only large enough to contain 4 or 5 trees." Elizabeth described Kingston as a small town of only about 50 wooden houses and only one house built of stone. She noted that Kingston held a harbor and a small garrison of soldiers who fired off a salute once the Simcoes arrived. Elizabeth Simcoe spent considerable effort trying to capture the Niagara River or Niagara Falls. This is hardly surprising. People who visit southern Ontario today still flock to the falls to take pictures. In this painting, she tried to capture a sense of the spray coming off the falls, which she claimed to see rising like a cloud, even from a distance of 40 miles. She wrote of how the river rushes in the most rapid manner, of how the rapids are a very fine sight, and of how the fall itself is the grandest sight imaginable, from the immense width of waters and the circular form of the Grand Falls. The whole center of the falls is frequently seen as a rainbow. She wrote of how these scenes have afforded me so much delight that I class these days with those in which I remember to have felt the greatest pleasure from fine objects, whether of art or of nature. Thankfully, she left behind a great legacy of art and nature that we can still enjoy 230 years later. Elizabeth and her husband made their first visit to the future site of the town of York, the future of city of Toronto, in 1793. Elizabeth recorded that her husband spoke in praise of the harbor and a fine spot near it covered in a large oak, where he intended to build the town. The paintings that Elizabeth made in York show some of the very first images that anyone ever produced of the area that would become Toronto. This painting shows the view along the waterfront, looking east towards the foot of Bathurst Street, where Fort York would eventually be built. Here's a similar scene that Elizabeth painted, looking in the other direction, westward towards the harbor at York and the foot of what became Bathurst Street. This was painted in the summer of 1793, about the same time that John Simcoe established the town of York. In 1794, the Simcoes built a summer home overlooking the Don River Valley, near where Parliament and Bloor Streets are today. The design of the home was inspired by a Greek temple, but it was built out of pine logs and wood. The Simcoes called this home Castle Frank. The castle part was supposed to make it sound as though it were a lot fancier than it actually was. Frank was for their infant son, Francis. The Simcoes explored the lower end of the Don River quite extensively when they were here. In fact, they were the ones who called it the Don River because it reminded them of the river of the same name back in England. Back when the Simcoes were here, the Don River was a great natural barrier, but Elizabeth Simcoe painted this image of the very first bridge over the Don River, which was made out of trees and logs that were tied together. Elizabeth Simcoe painted this cabin, which was on the Don River near Queen Street. It was the home of a man named John Scatting, who had been the Simcoe's estate manager back at Wolford Lodge in England. When John Graves Simcoe became lieutenant governor, John Scatting emigrated to Upper Canada and became Simcoe's aide-de-camp. I have one last stop that I want to make with you in following the Simcoes around the Toronto area. On August the 4th, 1793, Elizabeth wrote how she came within a sight of what is named on a government map, the Highlands of Toronto. The shore is extremely bold and has the appearance of chalk cliffs. They appeared so well that we talked of calling it Scarborough. These were, of course, the Scarborough Bluffs. A lot has changed since the Simcoes were here in the 1790s, but the Scarborough Bluffs were obviously every bit as impressive as a natural feature then as they are now. And like the Don River, Scarborough still bears the name given to it by John and Elizabeth Simcoe. Elizabeth Simcoe documented several types of flora and fauna that she saw in her travels here. Her and her husband also displayed the stereotypical fondness for pets that has long since been a virtue of the English people. She painted this butterfly that she saw in Montreal in 1792. She rendered two studies of the same specimen, which she described as being as black as rich velvet. This was a snowbird that she painted in Quebec in December of 1791. Her natural paintings show an attention to detail, and many of her illustrations document the ecological history of Quebec and Ontario. In a letter that she wrote to a friend back in England, she described life in Lower Canada as a new chapter in my life. The Simcoes adopted a pet dog at Niagara. They called him Jack Sharp, and he was a big, friendly, loyal companion. Jack Sharp belonged to a very Canadian breed of dog called a Newfoundland. His canine ancestors had been living off the island of Newfoundland for hundreds of years. Extracts from Elizabeth Simcoe's diary tell how Jack Sharp sometimes got himself into trouble. He once made enemies with a local raccoon, and another time he fought it out with a porcupine and got a neck full of quills for his trouble. In September of 1794, John Simcoe was exploring a lake that earlier Jesuit explorers had given a French name to. There had been an indigenous name for the lake long before this. Simcoe renamed it Lake Simcoe after his father. As they turned south back towards Toronto, they started to get lost. Food ran short, and over the next few days, they started to think of ways to avoid starving to death. And some members of the party started to cast hungry looks towards Jack Sharp, Simcoe's big Newfoundland dog. The group spotted the settlement at York just in time. Salvation was at hand, and Jack Sharp was spared. Presumably, Jack Sharp had no idea of the fate that he just managed to avoid. Elizabeth's paintings of the upper Canadian landscape show us how rugged it really was. Her and her companions often had to get creative just to survive. An entry in her diary on November the 20th, 1793, tells us how autumn was turning into winter and food was starting to get a little scarce. She wrote, "We dined in the woods and ate part of a raccoon. It was very fat and tasted like lamb if eaten with mint sauce. Most of us today would probably have to be pretty desperate to resort to this kind of thing, but hopefully raccoons were raised on a slightly healthier diet 200 years ago than they are today." Elizabeth Simcoe wrote of the vivid dreams that sometimes came to her when she had trouble sleeping. Now, it's no wonder that she had the occasional restless night, given the rough circumstances she lived under. There were many times that the only shelter she shared with her husband was a large canvas tent that had once belonged to the infamous explorer, Captain James Cook. Elizabeth Simcoe made this painting in July of 1793, and it shows the tents that were used as an encampment at Queenston Heights. The Simcoe's tent wasn't really a tent by our modern day standards. It was made from canvas that was stretched out on a wooden frame. It measured 7 meters or 22 feet by 4.5 meters or 15 feet. The tent could even be partially boarded up in colder weather. Elizabeth mentioned the tent in her diaries, writing how she had taken the canvas house we bought from England for my own apartment. It makes 2 very comfortably and remarkably warm private rooms. But there were other reasons why Elizabeth Simcoe might have had disturbing dreams. Although the American Revolution was technically over and done with, the situation was still tense and unstable. Most people expected an American invasion at just about any time. And the American Revolution had inspired an even bloodier and more terrifying uprising in France. The French Revolution was in full swing during the summer of 1793, when the Simcoes were traveling through Niagara and setting up the town of York, the future city of Toronto. The reign of terror would start that autumn. French aristocrats were losing their heads to the guillotine by the cartload, and the newly established French Republic had declared war on the British Empire. The French King Louis XVI was beheaded by the guillotine on January the 21st, 1793, just a few months before the Simcoes set up the town of York. His 37-year-old wife, Marie Antoinette, lost her head to the guillotine 9 months later on October the 16th, 1793. But news of this regicide took several months to cross the Atlantic and reach the Simcoes in Upper Canada. They finally learned the fate of the French royal couple on March the 1st, 1794. Elizabeth Simcoe wrote in her diary of the news received of the death of the Queen of France. The Simcoes had planned on hosting a dance that evening, but it was canceled out of solemn respect. Elizabeth wrote of the orders given out for mourning in which everybody appeared this evening. Just 4 days later, on March the 5th, 1794, Elizabeth wrote more about her growing anxiety. She dreaded that the Americans would assault the Canadian colonies. She wrote, There had been apprehensions of an attack on Lower Canada from Albany this winter. A week later, she recorded a terrifying dream in her diary. I dreamt sometime since that the governor, her husband, Mr. Talbot, who was her husband's personal secretary, and I were passing a wood possessed by an enemy who fired at us as fast as possible. I was so frightened that I have never since liked to hear a musket fired, and I am quite nervous when I hear of the probability of this country being attacked. So Elizabeth Simcoe wrote down her nightmare, in which she was running alongside her husband through the upper Canadian wilderness while being shot at by unseen enemies who were hiding in the forest. A lot of land in Upper Canada was still covered in dark forest. It made a perfect hiding place for a dreaded and murderous enemy. Elizabeth Simcoe wrote about another episode set in the forests of Upper Canada. Now, although this particular account had a dreamlike and nearly surreal quality, it actually took place in real life, while she and her husband were in Kingston at the beginning of July 1792. On Saturday, July the 7th, 1792, she wrote of how she walked this evening in a wood lately set on fire by some unextinguished fires being left by some persons who had encamped there, which in dry weather often communicates to the trees. She continued, "Perhaps you have no idea of the pleasure of walking in a burning wood, but I found it so great that I think I shall have some wood set on fire for my evening walks." The smoke arising from it keeps the mosquitoes at a distance, and when the fire has caught the hollow trunk of a lofty tree, the flame issuing from the top has a fine effect. In some trees where but a small flame appears, it looks like stars. As the evening grows dark, and the flare and smoke interspread in different masses of dark woods, has a very picturesque appearance. So it was that Elizabeth Simcoe, who could walk through a burning forest with a perfectly self-possessed sense of calm, had nightmares about being shot at in the woods by the enemies of the British Empire. As it turns out, she had reason enough to be worried about being ambushed by enemies. When the Simcoes finally left the Canadas in July of 1796 and tried to sail out the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, French warships were waiting for them. Their ship escaped, although the French seized some other English vessels. Elizabeth Simcoe wrote about hiding below deck with her children, and how she was in perfect misery every moment, expecting to hear the guns fire, as I had no idea what it was to be so frightened. Some refreshment was sent me, but I could not eat. I played at backgammon and cards, which tranquilizes my mind, but it'll be a great while before I recover my fight. But after weeks sailing back across the Atlantic, the Simcoes did eventually make it back to England. John Graves Simcoe was given a few other appointments, but his health was declining, and he died in Exeter in England on October the 26th, 1806. He was 54 years old. Elizabeth was 44 years old when her husband died. She lived as a widow for another 43 years and 3 months before dying at Wolford Lodge on January the 17th, 1850. Painting remained one of her greatest distractions, although she also evangelized for the Church of England and spent a lot of time surrounded by her children. Elizabeth Simcoe and her husband eventually had a total of 11 children. There were 8 daughters and 3 sons, who I've shown here on this genealogical chart. Elizabeth Simcoe wrote about finding herself often in that way, as she put it. Her first 5 children were daughters, but finally the son and heir that she longed for was born in June of 1791. This was Francis, who came with his parents across the Atlantic. It was also Francis for whom Castle Frank was named. Lieutenant Francis Willem Simcoe was killed in action on April the 6th, 1812, at the siege of Badajoz in Spain. He was 21 years old. The siege became an infamous event in the British fight against Napoleon. The British army accrued about 4,800 dead or wounded, and when they finally stormed the fortress, they went on a rampage. Plenty of British soldiers broke into homes and taverns, they stole alcohol, got drunk, and took out their revenge on the local inhabitants, sometimes in the very basic ways. It took 3 days for the unruly troops to be brought back in line. Meanwhile, Francis Simcoe was buried on the battlefield where he was decently interred, as Elizabeth wrote in her diary. On January the 16th, 1793, Elizabeth Simcoe gave birth to her seventh child. This was Catherine Simcoe, who came into the world in Niagara in the middle of a Canadian winter under the shelter of the Simcoe's large canvas tent. Young Catherine Simcoe became one of the first European children to be born in the province of Upper Canada. A little over a year later, in the spring of 1794, Elizabeth Simcoe was back here in the town of York while her husband was off traveling through Niagara. Young Catherine Simcoe, who was only 15 months old, went into what Elizabeth described as fits and spasms. She died the next morning on Easter Monday, April the 21st, 1794. Catherine Simcoe was buried in the military cemetery that John Graves Simcoe had established in 1793. These days, it's a public park, but shortly after the land at Wellington and Portland Streets was consecrated as a burial ground, Catherine Simcoe became the first person to be buried there. Another 400 people were eventually laid to rest in the cemetery before it was closed in 1863. The burial grounds were neglected for years. Only 17 of those original 400 gravestones still survive and have been restored. Sadly, Catherine Simcoe's stone is not among them. This is a sketch that Elizabeth Simcoe made of her son Francis. He was obviously a favorite because she often mentioned him in her diary. Although she wrote about Catherine in a few letters back home, there was no mention at all of Catherine's birth or her short life or her death in Elizabeth's journals. Similarly, Elizabeth made far fewer diary references to her husband John than one might imagine. She also hardly ever wrote about Sophia, the other child that she brought with her to Canada. Now, you've probably noticed that I've used this illustration of Elizabeth Simcoe again and again throughout my talk. That's because this is one of only 2 images that I've ever found of her. This is the other one. It shows Elizabeth Simcoe, obviously in her later years. She became domineering and dictatorial as she aged, especially towards her daughters. She wouldn't even let them sit down in her presence without her permission. Her word was family law. She never approved of any of their suitors. She forbade them to marry. They mostly stayed home and cared for her until she died on January the 17th, 1850, at the age of 87 years old. Only the youngest Simcoe daughter, Anne, got married, and this was after Elizabeth Simcoe died. Anne was 49 years old, and apparently none of her surviving sisters approved of her marriage. None of them went to the wedding, but she outlived all 10 of her siblings before dying in 1877 at the age of 73 years old. Only one son survived to maturity. This was Henry Addington Simcoe. None of his siblings ever had children, mostly because of the ways that Elizabeth forbade her daughters to get married. So it was up to her son Henry to carry on the family name. One of Henry Addington Simcoe's great-grandsons, through his eldest daughter, Anne Eliza Simcoe, was a man named Arthur Henry Linton. So he was a great-great-grandson of Elizabeth and John Graves Simcoe. Arthur Linton wasn't born with the Simcoe surname because the Simcoes were ancestors on his mother's side. But he adopted the Simcoe family name, adding it to his own and becoming Arthur Henry Linton Simcoe. His reason for doing this was a straightforward one. He wanted to inherit. He ended up getting the Simcoe family home at Wolford Lodge. I mentioned Wolford Lodge earlier. John Graves and Elizabeth Simcoe had built it for themselves back when they got married back in 1782. Wolford Lodge was mostly destroyed by a fire in the early 1920s, and Arthur Linton Simcoe sold off the estate in 1923. A brand new Wolford Lodge was built in 1929 in a style that was meant to duplicate the old lodge that the Simcoes had built. It's a hotel now, set in the countryside of the Blackdown Hills, an area that is still winning awards for its natural beauty. This is Elizabeth Simcoe's painting of the family chapel that the Simcoes built on their estate. The Wolford Chapel was consecrated in 1802. When the rest of the Wolford estate was sold off, there was a risk that the chapel might have been lost too, but fortunately, it was not included in the real estate transaction of 1923. A wealthy English publisher by the name of Sir Geoffrey Harmsworth brought the Wolford Chapel, and in 1966, he transferred the deed for the chapel to the province of Ontario. The chapel and the grounds are kept up by a local charity, but the property is quite literally a part of the province of Ontario. The Canadian national flag flies over the chapel, and it serves as a small piece of Canadian history found in the beautiful Devonshire countryside. There are small memorials like this one along the outside of the church, which commemorate various members of the Simcoe family. This is the memorial for Elizabeth Simcoe. The grave sites of Elizabeth's husband, John Graves Simcoe, as well as those for some of the couple's 11 children, are also nearby. Architectural legacies notwithstanding, I feel that Elizabeth Simcoe's greatest gift to us has been her artwork and her diary entries. Her painting and sketching were constant diversions throughout her widowhood, especially when she took trips through southwest England and Wales. But she openly admitted that the 5 years she spent in the Canadian colonies were the most exciting in her long life of 87 years. Thank goodness the paintings she made during her 5 years here have been preserved. She'd enjoyed it all, the rough crossing of the North Atlantic, the society life she found in Montreal and Quebec City, and even life living under a canvas tent out in the rugged bush in Niagara or in the fledgling little town of York, which is now the city of Toronto. The value of Elizabeth Simcoe's illustrations lay not so much in their merit as artwork, but in the fact that they gave those of us here and now in the 21st century a sense of what Canadian history and geography actually looked like about 230 years ago. One of Elizabeth Simcoe's major motivations in producing her art was to serve as a documentarian. She once wrote, "I took no sketch of a place I never wished to recollect." She was intentionally making a pictorial record of what she saw and loved. As for her diary, which I've used to accompany her illustrations, copies of it have alternately been published, then gone out of print, and then been rediscovered and printed again over the years. Were it not for Elizabeth Simcoe's work, we would have no idea what Toronto's harbor looked like in the 1790s. We wouldn't be able to compare the quiet, tree-covered shoreline with the unimaginable contrast of the 21st century megacity that we all know today. We wouldn't have any idea of what the early settlements at Montreal, Niagara, or Kingston, or the wilds that surrounded them looked like without Elizabeth Simcoe's work. These were then and are now important places in Canadian history, and she's helped to preserve their history for us. And without Elizabeth Simcoe's work, it would be harder for us to discover some of the similarities that connect people who lived here in the 1790s with those of us who live now. Elizabeth Simcoe has taught us that people have long since been in awe of the beautiful natural wonder of areas like Niagara Falls or the St. Lawrence River. In fact, whenever I give a talk on Elizabeth Simcoe, I'm constantly amazed at how much she's left for us to talk about over 200 years after she visited early Toronto and Upper Canada. I feel like I've only scratched the surface during the presentation that I've shared here. But I usually like to limit my talks to about 40 or 45 minutes, so perhaps this is a good place to conclude. If you're interested in learning more, you may be able to find a copy of Elizabeth Simcoe's diaries online or your local library. I've also posted a link to a great online exhibit by the Archives of Ontario. It's in the video description below, and this was a great resource for me in putting together my talk. And you can also get in touch with me and ask any questions or comments. I've also posted links in the video description below that will take you to my website for Muddy York Walking Tours, my Facebook group, and my Instagram account. Recently over Instagram, I shared several posts of Elizabeth Simcoe's work. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks again for tuning in.